People are looking for podcast content through Google. And even if they're not looking for podcast content per se, they're looking for answers to problems they're facing in their life. If your podcast can help solve that problem, you better believe if they find it on Google, they're going to click, they're going to find your website, they're going to listen to your podcast, and that's going to get that momentum moving forward of building trust and them becoming advocates of your brand. Good day to you, my friend. Welcome to episode 13 of Solo Podcasting Simplified. I'm your host, Jason Sircone, and before we take another step further, I want to take this opportunity to personally invite you to follow and subscribe to Solo Podcasting Simplified. This is the only podcast dedicated to all of your solo podcasting efforts, and I do not want you to miss a second of all the action. So whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast streaming app, please take a quick second to hit the follow button, hit the subscribe button, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so you're the very first person to know when new content goes live. Today, I want to take some time to piggyback off of some of the great conversation that took place on episode 12 of Solo Podcasting Simplified and dig a little deeper into the importance of having a website for your podcast. If you haven't listened to episode 12 yet, I highly recommend you take a second to jump back and listen to that episode in its entirety. I was joined by the one and only Mickey Anderson, and Mickey brought the goods to the microphone. She was the first guest featured on this show for that very reason. But in addition to that, she brought some tremendous insight and knowledge about solo podcasting, overall podcasting strategy, and she shared some phenomenal tips that you can implement into your initiatives today. So you don't want to miss that episode. And in addition to hearing all that great content, you'll have some further context for what I'm going to share today. Now, if you're a rebel and you want to go against the grain and you want to listen to this podcast first, it's your world, boss. I'm not going to hold it against you, but at some point, please jump back and take a listen to that episode. So without further ado, let's jump into why having a website for your podcast is so important. Now, there's no doubt that podcasting has evolved beyond just the audio component of this platform. Now, in my opinion, the audio component is always going to be the most important. That is the essence of podcasting. But we are now living in a world where creating this content isn't limited to just audio. We have the video component. We have the ability to transcribe and get all of our words that can be then transferred into blog content, website content, webinar content, social media content. We can do that on our own. There's also many AI tools out there that are helping us in this capacity. It's a beautiful world that we live in, and there's a lot at our disposal. And the most important part of that is the fact that we can reach our listeners in so many different ways. So just limiting yourself to having an audio podcast and nothing further really takes opportunity off your plate. And that's the last thing that you want to experience in the podcast space. Having a website in place for your podcast is a great showcase of how much importance you're putting on your podcast in the overall brand infrastructure that you're building. Now, you don't have to have a full-blown website that is completely dedicated to your podcast. That is absolutely an option. And I'm going to share a great way for you to do that if you don't have your own website as it is. But if you do, adding a page to your website to where you can reference episodes of your podcast and you can embed players and embed videos is a great way to add more value and real estate to your existing website. And as I said, it puts your podcast in a great spotlight for new visitors that land on your page. It's a great way for them to discover what your podcast is all about. And of course, you want to give them the option to listen to the podcast right there on your website as well. Now, if your website has blog capabilities, which it should, and if it doesn't, it's something that you can add, having a blog post for each individual episode is a phenomenal way to leverage SEO and build organic visibility on search engines like Google. People are looking for podcast content through Google. And even if they're not looking for podcast content per se, they're looking for answers to problems they're facing in their life. If your podcast can help solve that problem, you better believe if they find it on Google, they're going to click, they're going to find your website, they're going to listen to your podcast, and that's going to get that momentum moving forward of building trust and them becoming advocates of your brand. So having those blog posts in place on your website is a tremendous way to fuel SEO, and you give listeners and visitors to your website a centralized hub where they can find everything that your podcast contains. Anything that you want to make sure a listener experiences when they tune into an episode of your podcast should be featured on your blog post. So you can put in any resources that can potentially help your listener. Give them links to find the podcast on their favorite streaming app or on YouTube if you're featuring it there as well. Making it easier for them to discover the podcast outside of that blog post and get access to it even faster is just going to add more credibility to what you're building. You can also embed the audio player of your podcast on your blog post. You can also embed the video, and you can put the written text in place as well. So that's going to help with SEO, but you're also appealing to all the senses. If a person wants to listen, they've got it right there. If they want to watch the video, they've got it right there. If they want to read a little deeper, they got it right there. This blog post can serve as an unbelievable hub, and you absolutely do not want to look past this because, again, it showcases the importance you're putting on your podcast, but that discoverability that you gain through the search engines by having a great centralized location that ranks well and gives people exactly what they're looking for cannot be overlooked. It can add so much value to your podcast and your brand as a whole. And that's really what it's all about, right? Adding credibility to your brand and using your podcast content to help you do so. So here's a question for you. What's the biggest plague in podcasting? The answer is pod fade. Pod fade is when creators stop producing new content abruptly and disappear with no warning. It happens far too often in the podcast space, and I do not want you to fall victim to it. Successful podcasting begins with clarity. So today, I'm inviting you to join me for a podcast clarity session. Together, we'll dive deep into your creative ideas, tighten your content focus for maximum impact, develop actionable strategies for all of your podcast initiatives, and set you up to grow your show with purpose and confidence. When our session is complete, you'll have a clear mindset and an actionable strategy to build a podcast for your coaching and consulting business that makes connections that last a lifetime. Schedule a 1 or 2 hour podcast clarity session with me today at jasonsircone.com/clarity. You can find the link in the show notes. Podcast content, as I said, is not just the audio format anymore. There's so much value in the words that you're creating for that audio if you're recording them in an environment where you also have the video component, and then you can also utilize the written component. You've got so many different avenues in place for someone to find you, to get value from you, to feel that impact that you're trying to bring to their life. And then ultimately, as they become a more dedicated listener to your show, that's going to bring them closer to the transformation they seek. And that's when they're going to take things to the next level by investing in your programs, in your book, in your course, whatever you have in place as your offer. Having them on your website is going to keep them very close to that offer and where you have all the information on that as well. So in addition to the SEO benefits that get people to your website, now that they've landed there, not only are they accessing your podcast and getting all of this great information, but they're also very close to your offer. And the more they build trust in your brand through the solo podcast content that you're producing for them, the more they're seeing that offer as well. And this gives them a great reason to move forward with your offer because you've already brought a great deal of transformation to their life. They know what's on your website. They've more than likely looked around. They've seen what they like. And now that they've established more trust and they take things to the next level in their own mind, you're the source that's brought them transformation to this point. Now you can help them get to the finish line. And that's when they invest in your program. They invest in your course, your book, whatever you have in place as an offer. Not having a website for your podcast or having your podcast content featured on your existing website is a big miss. And as Mickey explained on episode 12, it can make your brand less valuable. She told the story of her colleague that had a website and it was jam-packed with all kinds of content, including her podcast. And she was able to sell that brand for over $1 million. That podcast content contributed to the overall value and worth of her brand, and it more than likely upped her coinage. So you don't want to leave this content off and just let it be out there in the ether. Now, there are a lot of ways, obviously, people can discover it if they're Spotify members, Amazon Music subscribers, on Apple Podcasts, you name it, whatever platform of choice they use, they can obviously find it there. But centralizing it on your website is going to take your brand to new levels and, again, make you much more valuable should you ever decide to exit. So again, I wanted to take this opportunity today to expand on what Mickey brought to the mic and talked about as far as websites go. It's tremendous real estate that you want to take advantage of, not just for the simple fact that it will take your brand to a higher level if you ever decide to exit, but the SEO benefits alone make it worthwhile. And for me, I look at any podcast that has a very strong website presence. It tells me that the creators behind that podcast are taking it seriously and they really want to emphasize what they're doing with that content. So be that person, be that creator. Make sure you're leaning into your website in some way, shape, or form to build this content. And if you are unsure of how you can build a blog post, jump over to my blog, my website, and you can find the link in the show notes, whether you're on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. I have a link to the blog post that I put together for every episode, and you can get an idea of everything that you can put into a blog post. So take a look at my site. You'll get a good idea of how to lay your blog post out. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer those questions for you. One last thing I want to talk to you about before I let you go today. If you don't have a website already built for your brand, or if you do want to build something that is adjacent but slightly separate that's specifically built for your podcast, there's a tremendous service that I want to recommend to you today. It's called Podpage. Podpage will help you build a website for your podcast in 5 minutes or less. With this service, you'll have a beautiful website in place and you'll begin to build that website presence that your podcast needs. I've included a link to Podpage in the show notes if you do want to check that out and take advantage of it. This is an affiliate link, so I will receive a small commission if you do sign up, full disclosure, but highly recommend checking out Podpage because if you don't have that website presence in place, this is a great way to get started. If you do have an existing website for your brand, having this podcast content linked to it is going to help your podcast go to the next level and beyond. One more time for everyone in the back. Do not overlook having a website for your podcast. The SEO benefits alone are going to help your show grow and find more listeners that are ultimately going to become advocates of your brand. And everything else that I've described today are elements of the podcasting game that you do not want to overlook. Get that website presence built ASAP. And again, if you have any questions about how to get started, check out what I've got at jasonsircone.com, and always feel free to reach out to me if you need additional assistance. So with that, we are going to turn off the lights on episode 13 of Solo Podcasting Simplified. I hope you had a good time. I know I did. Until our paths cross again on episode 14, this is Jason Sircone on Solo Podcasting Simplified. Good talk. I'll see you out.